You know, man, by far the most iconic scene of Elden Ring's DLC is
Curse you, Bale! I hereby vow you will rue this day. Behold, a true great warrior, and I, Egon, your fears made flesh. Solid of scale you might be, foul dragon, and I will riddle with holes your rotten hide. With a hail of harpoons, with every last drop of my being.
and not this tree we learn nothing about. Well, we actually learn things about it, but for the story of the DLC, the Scadutree is utterly irrelevant. With this here being actually all the information we can learn about the Scadutree from various in-game items, which however is, surprisingly, enough information to piece together the origins of the Scadutree and its function, of which the most important detail comes from the Scadutree avatar's remembrance stating, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree," showing in its incantation, Land of Shadow as well, that it not only bears the Erdtree symbol, but also uses gold in its attack, which is accompanied by shadow. The fact that this tree is described as the shadow of the Erdtree and is named Scadutree in Old English are, I think, very deliberate choices to convey something important here. It feels like they're making it super clear that these trees have not only been around for a long time, but probably also showed up simultaneously, making them essentially twin trees. In fact, their creation is a result of Queen Marika's action with the help she received from the Two Fingers. By that, I'm referring to the Two Fingers' involvement in their creation, which is hinted at through the Crimson Seed Talisman +1, implying their contribution through not only its iconography, but also via the following item description. The Erdtree seed of this talisman was presumed to be an object of myth. This age-old artifact also depicts the Two Fingers, perhaps harking back to the birth of the Erdtree. So, basically the Two Fingers, and by extension Marika, had a hand in creating the Erdtree. And as the Seed Talisman's +1 version comes in two variants, with the Two Fingers being depicted in both, this suggests that there were actually two seeds used. One for the Erdtree and the other one possibly for the Scadutree. Another strong piece of evidence linking these two trees together via a similar creation process is that both of them hewn remembrances of bosses into them with very distinct color choices. The Erdtree's remembrances having a strong golden hue to them, while the Scadutree's ones are shrouded in darkness and primarily use dark colors, highlighting not only that both represent their respective opposite, light and shadow, but I think this visual distinction goes far further than this. I believe that both trees, although having the same origin, were created for vastly different purposes. With the Erdtree and its faith being all about life and reincarnation, by returning the souls of corpses back to the Erdtree and reincarnating them eventually. While the Scadutree handles the sealing of death, probably pulling people out of that reincarnation cycle and essentially removing them from existence. I'll dive deeper into why I think that later in the video, as I have to cover some other points with you prior, so that you can fully understand why I believe this. One such interesting point being its connection to the Hornsent and showing us just how old these trees are. When we talk to the Hornsent, he refers to the Scadutree as
"Go to the misshapen tree of Umbra."
Its misshapen aspects are obvious, but more interesting is the term Umbra used here. The word Umbra refers to shadow or darkness and is a direct translation from Latin. In a symbolic sense, it can represent the subconscious, hidden aspects of life or a place of mystery and introspection. Umbra may also suggest an association with things that are hidden, such as inner fears, doubts, secrets, or in our particular case, a sealed-off realm. I would interpret the phrasing used by the Hornsent here that throughout their culture's entire existence, the tree has always been that way. In fact, the ancient nature of the Scadutree is evidenced by the culture of the Hornsent. Across Ballarat and Erdtree, we find stone tablets that depict a tree shaped like a spiral. A sign clearly representing the Scadutree, since its base and all the way to its top matches the spiral, as seen on these ancient carvings. The spiral symbol itself is deeply connected to the Crucible, the central belief system of the Hornsent, which thrived long before Marika's era. In fact, the spiral symbol's connection to divinity dates as far back as to the time of Thermosula and the ancient dragons, marking it as the earliest appearance with Placidusax in his cutscene doing this spiral pose, which furthermore suggests that the belief in its divine implications are truly ancient. Given that the spiral is sacred to the Hornsent, and having been a symbol of divinity to this very day, as seen in the Envoy's horn instruments, it's likely that the Hornsent also worshipped the Scadutree to some extent, which is supported by the presence of Scadutree fragments found in Erdtree. With both these fragments and the tree's distinctive spiral shape depicted in countless stone tablets, the Scadutree definitely played a role in the Hornsent's religious belief system, although not quite as intense as within Messmer's army, people of Erdtree society. As noted in the Scadutree's fragments, the people of the Erdtree collect the splinters and use them in prayer. Something that is reflected in the scene behind Commander Gaius' arena, where we can find the Scadutree chalice positioned to catch fragments falling directly from the tree. The fact that these soldiers collect these fragments for prayer further strengthens the link between the Scadutree and the Erdtree, and, by extension, to Marika herself, in the sense that the Scadutree isn't a foreign threat to the Erdtree and is instead viewed as an object of worship in the same way as is the case with the Erdtree in the lands between. This in turn also explains why those who rebelled against Messmer were buried away from the Scadutree's site. It's a form of punishment that never again allows them to gaze upon their object of worship, further cementing the fact that the Scadutree is of the same spiritual importance to Messmer's men like the Erdtree, and also why they bear its emblem on their armors. And I furthermore also think this fragment collection practice is a parallel to the Age of Plenty, back when the Erdtree still produced its sap. The icon shield description gives us a glimpse into this era. Great shield, painted with a divine scene, the recipients of a blessed tear from the Erdtree, an item that looks back fondly on the Age of Plenty. During this time, the Erdtree sap was collected by its followers and crafted into medallions that boost core stats like HP, MP, and Stamina, with the item description of the Crimson Amber Medallion telling us about this practice. The Erdtree's old sap becomes amber, treasured as the most precious of jewels in the Age of Godfrey, the first Elden Lord. With the different Amber Medallion versions, we learn furthermore that the more amber they put into them, the stronger the respective core stat boost becomes, showing a parallel to how with each Scadutree fragment we consume, we in turn become more powerful. But this age came to a close with the burning of the Erdtree, irreversibly changing it, as the Blessed Dew Talisman explains. It was once thought that the blessed sap of the Erdtree would drip from its boughs forever, but that Age of Plenty swiftly came to a close, and with time, the Erdtree became more an object of faith. Here, we see another parallel between the Erdtree and the Scadutree, in that both trees produce something that is used by its worshippers. While the Erdtree sap had to be processed into amber for its power to be accessible, the Scadutree fragments retain their strength without being crafted into something. The Erdtree boosts the physical body's capabilities, while the Scadutree focuses on enhancing physical attack and defense capabilities, representing the Erdtree as defensive force, while the Scadutree can be viewed as an offensive one. Plus, with the Scadutree still possessing golden sap, due to it not having been burned, unlike the Erdtree. This also explains why we can find 20 of them throughout the DLC, giving us powers without having to be processed in any significant way. Potentially also highlighting that in order for the products of these trees to affect us, they either need to be harnessed into a special trinket, or the tree shouldn't have been burnt so that it can on its own spread its power. I think this because the Scadutree exists in a pocket dimension, completely isolated from the lands between, and its powers can't influence us outside of this realm. And without any trinkets harnessing the power of the fragments on their own, we cannot enjoy the same buffs in the lands between. Of course, this is just my speculation. However, it feels like a plausible explanation for From Software to introduce this unique mechanic, whilst also from a game design choice preventing us from becoming too overpowered in the base game. The Scadutree is as such undeniably tied to offensive powers, as not only evidenced by the effects of its fragments, but also by its Thorn sorceries. The spell Impenetrable Thorns not only shows this offensive nature through its item description, but also elaborates on what it represents. Sorcery of those who abandoned the practice of incantations after devout faith rewarded them with only despair. Summons the Scadutree's impenetrable thorns from the ground. Similarly, the Mantle of Thorns describes these thorns in the following way. Covers the caster in impenetrable thorns grown from the Scadutree, showing on one hand that these impenetrable thorns originate from the Scadutree, and at the same time that both of them come with an edict describing the nature of those using them. The image of the twisted Scadutree is an edict. Denounce their ways, do them harm, for they have abandoned us. Spurn all that exists, wound all that exists, for we have been abandoned. An edict echoing feelings of abandonment and a desire to do harm unto those who left them behind. As for whether this edict can be attributed towards one particular party, is anyone's guess really. On one hand, it perfectly echoes the feelings of Messmer's army, who felt abandoned by Marika and grew to despise Messmer, who asked his men to direct their maledictions towards him alone. But it could also just as easily reflect the Hornsent, who were betrayed and hunted during Marika's crusade against them. Both parties share this sense of rejection as well as resentment towards Marika and the Erdtree. And there's also the possibility that this edict isn't so much linked to one particular group, but rather a reflection of what the Scadutree represents, spurning anything it is in opposition of, and even going so far as to harm it with its impenetrable thorns, should it try to force its way in. Also, another thing we have to consider here is whether these impenetrable thorns are the same ones Radagon used to seal off the Erdtree. After all, anything linked to the Scadutree seems to specifically involve impenetrable thorns, including the Scadutree avatar, the dark counterpart to the Erdtree avatars. And its remembrance gives us a deeper insight into the darker nature of the Scadutree we have talked about already. It reads, "The Scadutree is the shadow of the Erdtree, born of dark notions that bear no sense of order, that twist and bend its stock, rendering it brittle." Its last sentence here is very ambiguous. So much so that if we take it at face value, there's nothing we can learn from it. But then, what if we take its keywords and try to put it into context with other things we discover throughout the DLC? For example, the part, "born of dark notions," makes me think it's a premonition of why it was created. Maybe it references how Marika planned to betray the Hornsent from the start, tricking them with a tree that resembled the Crucible Spiral and wiping out their enemies, the Fire Giants, just to give them a false sense of safety. Whilst later, sending Messmer and his army to obliterate them in order to satisfy her desire for revenge. Then the phrase, no sense of order could mean that the Scadutree isn't tied to the greater will, representing the concept of order. The phrasing of the word order here isn't its only instance within the DLC and appears within the minor Erdtree incantation through the line, "Only the kindness of gold without order." Marika bathing her village in gold wasn't something anyone with ties to the greater will instructed her to do. As such, we could come to the same conclusion with the Scadutree here, being described as bearing no sense of order. After all, neither Marika, the two fingers, nor Meteor were in direct contact with the greater will and lost contact with it a long time ago. Operating independently of it, meaning that the decision to create both the Erdtree and the Scadutree was very likely solely theirs. And the part, twist and bend its stock, rendering it brittle, could be a critique of the Golden Order itself, reflecting its flawed nature due to its origins. Something people like Count Emir, Goldmask, and ultimately us later realized, with it having gods that are no better than men. Drawing these parallels between all of these points isn't even too far-fetched if we take a look at the item description of the Shadow Sunflower. A large flower that blooms facing the Scadutree, found near the Scadutree. These flowers, veiled in shadow and covered in impenetrable thorns, are suffused with profound holiness, much akin to the Scadutree itself. Both the Scadutree, its sunflowers, and by extension its thorns are described as having profound holiness, which indicates a deep spiritual significance, hence tying it to the powers of an outer god or divinity like Marika. With everything we have looked at so far, I would take this as another piece of evidence in that Marika created both the Scadutree and the Erdtree around the same time with the help of these two seeds she obtained from her two fingers. Yet this action wasn't sanctioned by the greater will, but more of an independent action of its agents. Which in turn explains why the Scadutree bears no sense of order, even though it was created by the leader of the Golden Order. Plus, the connection between Marika and the Scadutree could also suggest that Marika is able to summon its power at will, specifically in regards to its impenetrable thorns. After all, it is a possibility that she was the one who summoned the thorns during the battle against the Fire Giants, which we know she was present for due to the echo of Marika in her church atop the mountain tops. It is strange for her to be directly involved in a war, when throughout the entire history of the Lands Between, this is the only mention of her actively participating in one. But her presence, Marika's ties to the Scadutree as its creator, and with all the Fire Giants at the mountain peak being covered in all of these thorns, this would tie up this oddity nicely, allowing Messmer in turn to easily impel the Fire Giants by immobilizing them with the Scadutree's thorns. Though we cannot be 100% certain that these thorns are indeed originating from the Scadutree, I believe it to be very likely. Especially with the context in mind that Radagon, with his direct connection to Marika, was able to block access to the Erdtree using impenetrable thorns. With no other source for these kind of thorns, I'm all but convinced that these have to originate from the Scadutree and that Marika, as its creator, has some kind of control over them. And I also wouldn't dismiss all of this as wild speculations, since the Scadutree is heavily linked to the action of sealing something off, especially things Marika wanted to seal off. That something being Aenir Lim, because she ordered Messmer, during the crusade against the Hornsent, to seal it off with the sealing tree we find at the Church of the Bud. This tree plays a critical role in sealing off Aenir Lim, engulfing it in a black veil with giant black thorns, holding it in place with a choking pose. A sealing that can only be undone by burning it with Messmer's kindling. What you might have missed here is that the sealing tree is modeled after a smaller version of the Scadutree, particularly the twisting trunk wrapping around its straighter trunk counterpart. One identical part of the Scadutree, together with black Thorns sealing off Enir limb, gives us yet another point of involvement of this tree and its Thorns playing a role in blocking access to something. 2 points to draw a connection with. And I wouldn't stop here, but take this thought even further and argue that the Scadutree is likely the key to sealing off the Shadowlands from the lands between. We've seen 2 instances of the Shadowtree's Thorns being used to restrict entry and sealing off an entire place even. With the tree dominating the landscape of the Shadowlands, spanning the entire region, it's reasonable to assume Marika maybe used it as a primary tool to close off this realm. Although this might seem like the biggest stretch in this video, my idea is actually backed up by another observation: the veils that converge at the tip of the Scadutree and cover the Shadowlands skies. These veils bear a striking resemblance to those found in Marika's bedchamber, hinting at a deeper connection between her and the ones we find in the skies here. While it's highly speculative, it's not too unreasonable to consider the idea that Marika used this Scadutree to seal off the Shadowlands from the lands between, because we already have the precedent of veils being used in a concealing manner by the Black Knife assassins. Their cloaks are made of a concealing veil, of which a part was fashioned into a talisman, confirming its properties with the following description: completely conceals the wearer's presence. Part of one of the concealing veils used by the assassins on the night of the Black Knives. And as we furthermore learn about these assassins via the Black Knife armor, the assassins that carried out the deeds of the night of the Black Knives were all women and rumored to be newmen who had close ties with Marika herself, giving us yet another connection between Marika and the use of veils to entirely cloak something, which in turn makes it even more likely that the Scadutree plays a role in the sealing of the Shadowlands. Though whether you agree with my assessment of the Scadutree playing a key part in the sealing of these lands will be up to you, as it is quite a big speculation on my part. But considering all of these small details and connections, I think that the Scadutree is somehow involved in this process. Yet the specifics of how this was done remain a mystery. And equally mysterious is the nature of the Shadutree's connection to death. Even before the release of the DLC, I had noted the strong ties between the Shadowlands and the concept of death. A theme that is further reinforced by the suppressing pillar, specifically the stone slab at its top, which reads, "The very center of the lands between. All manners of death wash up here, only to be suppressed." One of the most literal interpretations of this can be found at the Cerulean coast, where large stone coffins filled with masses of dead bodies wash ashore. For more on this topic and interesting IRL historical parallels, I would recommend checking out Tarnished Archaeologist's recent video. But instead of accepting the most literal meaning, I want to instead focus on its line about death being suppressed. This hints at something deeper with ties to the Scadutree as well, for suppressing is essentially the same as sealing something off. So, what if the tree is not only sealing off the Shadowlands, but is also playing a key role in suppressing the very concept of death? An idea I base on 2 key observations. The first is Godwin's presence being restricted entirely to the catacombs of these lands. Throughout the DLC, we only see part of him and his Deathblight within these tombs, almost seemingly confined to the singular place. Also, Deathblight doesn't spread as freely in the Shadowlands as it does in lands between, where it can even reach the most remote areas like Fel Mesula. This containment suggests that something, possibly the Scadutree, is keeping death, aka Godwin and his Deathblight, more under control here. The second piece of evidence is the presence of the black spirits found throughout Ballarat, the graveside plains, the specimen storeroom in the Shadowkeep, and the Wa'u ruins. As I explained in my Messmer's Army lore video, these spirits were burnt by Messmer's flame, which is capable of destroying both body and soul of a person. The furnace golems wield this flame, who were used in the crusade to wipe out the Hornsent, and their attacks should have completely erased anyone. Yet, despite being burnt by this flame, these black spirits still exist, even continuing their lives throughout the Shadowlands, and also doing research in the specimen storeroom and Wa'u ruins, like nothing happened. Their very existence contradicts the idea of being entirely destroyed by Messmer's flame, unless something greater is preventing them from truly dying and vanishing. Given the Shadutree's role in sealing off and suppressing things, I believe that these spirits' current state is a direct result of the Shadotree suppressing death in the Shadowlands. The tree seems to be a vital part of holding death at bay by not only keeping these spirits from fully passing on, but by also preventing the uncontrolled spread of death blight in the Shadowlands. Though whether the Shadotree has any stronger ties to death itself, or might even play a role in Marika's act of removing the Rune of Death, is unfortunately impossible to say. Because there isn't anything else in the entire game to further prove a connection between the tree and death. Still, the stone tablet atop the suppressing pillar speaks of the Shadowlands as the place where all manners of death wash up. So, there might be a chance that the Shadowtree's involvement with death goes far deeper than we can imagine. Do let me know about your thoughts on the connection between the Shadotree and death, as I'm curious about your ideas on this matter. At any rate, the Shadotree is essentially the sibling tree to the Erdtree, mirroring it in nearly every aspect, whilst at the same time offering us a glimpse of what the Erdtree might have been like before it was burnt, when it still had the power to produce sap. And unlike the Erdtree, the Shadotree is more closely aligned with death and the darker side of Marika and her Golden Order. The literal shadow of the Erdtree concealing the darker parts of Marika and her Order's nature, banishing anything undesirable through the tree's impressive sealing properties, manifesting via its impenetrable thorns that set the tree further apart from its counterpart in the lands between, whose sealing powers were also likely used for cutting off the Shadowlands from lands between and hindering anyone from entering the Erdtree. I hope that this video helped you to understand this mystery from the DLC. If you enjoyed it, then please subscribe to the channel and stay tuned for more Elden Ring content. And for a more comprehensive dive into the lore of Messmer's army, check out my video on Messmer and his forces. Until next time, auf Wiedersehen.